This is a great honor to have you all today, as we will have an interesting topic to discuss. This is about public sector accounting and development insight from emerging economies. My name is Yusita Marini, and this is an honor to be the moderator for this event. Ladies and gentlemen, this event will be directed in order starting from opening ceremony, opening speech by Head of Public Financial Accounting Study Program, photo section, topic discussion, certificate awarding, will an excitement ambitious. Let us listen solemnly to the international anthem of Indonesia, followed by hymne of Universitas Terbuka. Thank you. After we both out spirit up, we would like to invite you to pray with our belief for successful of this seminar. Prayer begin. Thank you for the prayer. This is now time to hear the opening speech from Head of Public Financial Accounting Study Program to Mrs. Ratna Martasari Dewi, SA MSCC AK. Time is yours.
Thank you very much, Ibu Yusita. Yeah, my name is Ratna Marta Dewi, Ibu Yusita. Okay.
Yeah.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon and welcome to the International ELecturing Public Financial Account Program terbuka. A warm heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed speaker, Prof. Pawan Andikari from ESSEC Business School, University of ESSEC, UK. Hello, Prof. Nice to meet you, Prof.
Hello, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and special thanks to the dedicated committee for their tireless efforts in making this event a reality, and all the participants for joining us today. This international lecturing activity is a regular event held every semester. It's aimed to provide a deeper understanding subjects within public financial accounting. In this program, we will explore comparative study from experts in their field from various countries. Today, we will focus on the public sector accounting course. Over the next 2 days, we will delve into two fascinating themes. First, public sector accounting and development, insight from emerging economics, and the last, public sector accountability for climate change and the circular economy. We hope that this program enhances our understanding of public sector accounting, enabling us to become even more valuable contributors to society. This aligns with the Public Financial Accounting Study Program Universitas Terbuka tagline, accelerating better public services. Finally, I encourage you to actively participate and ask questions if you need clarification. Our resource person will be happy to provide further information. Thank you and enjoy the program. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for the motivation speech, Mrs. Ratna or Ibu Ratna. Now, this is time to hear our amazing speaker that will deliver his insight about public sector accounting and development, insight from emerging economies. In this section, we have special speakers, Professor Pawan Andikari. Before we start the seminar session, first I will introduce our speaker. Let me read this curriculum vitae or CV. Yeah, we know that Professor Pawan Andikari is a professor of accounting at ESSEC Business School and the director of the ESSEC Accounting Center, University of Essex. He is an associate editor of the Journal of Public Budgeting, Accounting and Financial Management. He served in executive board of Competitive International Government Accounting Research, or it's called CIGAR. He is a co-chair of the CIGAR PhD Colloquium. Professor Andikari's research is primarily within the domain of public sector accounting. His research is widely used in policy making in South Africa. Professor Andikari was part of the team that was awarded in 2023 the Best International Research Impact by the University of Essex. He is a recipient of several award grants, the European Commission Erasmus Plus, the World Bank or PEFA Research Award on 3 occasions, and the Africa Accounting and Financial Association AAFA Award, the SRC EEA Impact Fund, the Priority Challenge Project Fund, GCRF and SANSS supervisory, and of which have enabled his to team up in facilitating research in areas such as citizen engagement, circular economic, climate budgeting and accountability, financial resilience, and public financial management experience in UK and countries in Asia and Africa. Beyond accounting, Professor Andy Curry has collaborated with researchers working in the department such as sociology and criminology and developed research on migrant entrepreneurship, child trafficking, and the post-COVID entrepreneurship on emerging economies. Professor Andy Carey has so far supervised 11 PhD student upon completion at an internal and external examiner for 16 studies each. He is currently involved in the supervisor of 7 students. In 2019, Professor Andy Carey was awarded the best postgraduate supervisor at the faculty level at the University of Essex. Now, please welcome Professor Pawan Andikari. Professor Pawan, time is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ruchita. Very generous introduction. Can I share my slide, please? So thank you very much again. And my name is Pawan Adhikari, and I work as a professor of accounting at Essex Business School. I also work as a director for our Essex Accounting Center at the University of Essex. And today I'll be talking about this mostly about public sector accounting in emerging market or emerging economy. First, I start with how this public sector accounting has come to the mainstream accounting research. I'll focus on ongoing debates on public sector accounting reform and some insight into how public sector accounting is connected to development discourses of international organizations. I have some insight from evolving research in public sector accounting after COVID or pandemic, and I have some concluding remarks. But if you have any questions, you can stop me anytime and we can discuss that further. So basically, when you talk about accounting, because they say before 1970s or 1980s, accounting was seen more as a technology. It's like more kind of functionalistic way of thinking accounting, and the scholars were talking that accounting is important for financial decision making. So that kind of concept prevailed during 60s, 50s, 70s. But in 1970s or 80s, we see the rise of some scholars like this Hopwood, Miller, Burchell, and those scholars, they try to argue that accounting is more than a technology, because accounting has wider implication. Accounting has implication in society. So we should understand accounting, or we should interpret accounting more as a social and institutional practice. So that was the time when the thinking of accounting started widening. And you see in let's say at that time, if you see in during 1980s, there are very few papers or research in public sector accounting. Although there were research and accounting, there's many accounting historical research. They try to understand how the government were collecting revenue, about the emergence of taxation or standard costing within the setting of public sector. But public sector, how it is very few people directly connected to public sector accounting in developing countries. And in 2000, but then in the last few, let's say last 2 or 3 decades, we can see that public sector accounting has now become a distinct discipline within the mainstream accounting, because today we have many journals that publish paper on public sector accounting. We have our own research communities like SIGAR, IRSPM, and we have our niche conferences. Let's say we have this public sector accounting accountability group conference. We have SIGAR workshop. So it means now the public sector accounting is seen as a distinct discipline within the mainstream accounting. And And very often the researchers argue that because from 1980s have been adapted by public reforms were referred to by using the term new public management, new public or digital, now more recently digital governance, etc. And the researchers argue that that is the moment that or those reforms have helped develop public sector accounting research, because many, we can see many paper in AAAJ or FEM, and they have published paper in public sector accounting connecting that with NPM. So the last 2-3 decades has been referred to as golden age in terms of how say promoting public sector accounting research. Now we have research or papers and accounting standard. We have papers and project management, mainstream accounting journal. Because now the researcher have rise in public sector accounting research. But the idea is now we need to go beyond, because in the last 2 or 3 decades, we're basically trying to improve how is a measurement or improve reporting by using accrual principle. But the idea now, the idea evolving at the moment is we need to make public sector accounting more public accounting should be developed in a way that will help people and society for betterment. So those are the values, or those are the ideas developing at present. So now the researchers are talking about publicness, they talk about public value creation, they talk about how to deliver better public services through digitalization. And they were talking about how say resolving grand problems, like we are facing problem from climate change, we are facing and how say more concern about sustainability. So the public sector accounting help address those grand challenges. And these are some of the examples. So I'm starting from the reform. So basically, what is the main idea? The idea is that public sector accounting is very important in the sense because it will help realize efficiency and effectiveness in resource mobilization and service delivery. But at the same time, at the wider level, institutional level, public sector accounting is also linked to improving governance or restoring accountability, development and achieving economic growth, mainly in developing country context. So the idea is that to achieve these goals or to achieve these aims is very important for public, it's very important for countries or governments to improve their accounting or reform their accounting system. And one way to improve the accounting is by or through the adoption of accrual accounting that is being used by private sector entities. So the last 2 decades, we see a lot of papers, even from developing countries like Indonesia, even Thailand, or many developing countries in Africa. We see a lot of papers, and they were talking about the reforms, how the governments or public sector entities are trying to change their accounting system, how they are trying to adapt with accrual accounting, what kind of challenges they are encountering, what kind of benefits they have engendered. So those those are the topic of public sector accounting research. And in this period, we also saw or witnesses a large number of papers like literature review. They are trying to show how different countries are adapting the reform, or they are trying to how to consolidate the finding of the research that has been done in public sector in developing countries. So for instance, there's a literature review by this Lapsley and Miller, Funk and Carlson. There's we also did literature review on public sector accounting in Journal of Accounting, Emerging Economy. And more recently, we did literature review on the adoption of Ipsos in emerging economy and low-income countries. So our idea is to show at what stages the countries are in terms of adapting Ipsos or International Public Sector Accounting Standards. So it means so all this research, so there's a growing interest of researchers in public sector accounting. And in 2016, we together with colleague, I did some research on OECD countries and trying to understand how these countries are improving or reforming their public sector accounting. And then we identified that at least the different groups of countries. Let's say on the one hand, there are countries like Australia, New Zealand, UK, where we can see that these countries have adapted accrual accounting not only for reporting, but they prepare their annual budget or long-term budget also relying on accrual principle. So means accounting and budgeting both are based on accrual principle. And there are many other countries where we find that those countries or governments are preparing their financial statements following accrual, but in terms of budget, they still follow cash-based budget. And there are some countries like even like Germany, Greece, Ireland, where they haven't adapted full accrual accounting, and they have adapted certain elements of accrual principle in their reporting. And even today, we'll find a lot of countries like for instance, that there's but what we find is the increasing number of emerging countries like Brazil, Indonesia, China, South Africa. They all are how to say making a transition toward accrual accounting for reporting. And the argument that based on this research, there are different arguments because many researchers or if we follow the report of international organizations like World Bank or Asian Development Bank and or even IFAC, we see a lot of reports, and in these reports there are a number of benefits of accrual accountings have been highlighted. For instance, they argue that it is important for countries or government to adapt accrual accounting to improve transparency in research allocation. Accrual accounting will help identify full cost of government activities. It will help analyze government overall financial position and financial performance. And more importantly, through the adoption of accrual accounting, government can provide useful information about the sustainability or their SDG goal or their resilience, to what extent they are resilient. So those are the benefits we find benefits outlined in the reports of many of the organizations. And we also studied the adoption of reform in different countries. And in one of the paper, we have tried to identify, okay, what kind, for instance, what kind of implementation strategy the countries have adapted. We also try to understand what are the factors motivating or driving countries to implement accrual accounting or to adapt accounting changes. Or we also try to see what kind of challenges these countries are experiencing and at what level they are in terms of implementing reform. For instance, we study Anglo-Saxon countries, Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, UK, which we try to summarize the development taking place in Nordic countries, non-Nordic European countries, and OECD members. So basically what we can see in terms of drivers, we can see the internal factor. Like in many cases, we can find these internal factors are more dominant in terms of putting pressure for government to go for reforms. At the same time, if we go to Nordic countries, there's a limited institutional pressure, internal resources and practice more, because for instance, like in developed country, we see a lot of pressure coming from international organization, but that is not the case in many like a Nordic country like Norway, Sweden, Finland. They are doing more, there's more reforms are seem to be more internal process, internal mechanisms, and it's taking place quite more gradually and more slowly. So the whole idea here is, of course, because what we see by studying reform in different countries is that there are different factors motivating countries or government to improve their accounting. Countries have implemented different strategies, so we don't have one strategy to implement or to implement public sector accounting reforms. And the consequences of reforms have been very different in in different contexts, and different kind of challenges have been experienced in the process of implementing public sector accounting reform. So the whole idea is that reform has been very heterogeneous. It's not one house. There's no one clear direction how to adapt or implement reform, because many countries, different countries have adapted different approaches. Like for instance, we find in some countries they started from local government and they gradually start reforming the accounting at the central government. But in some countries, we found that reform started at the very central level and cascaded to local level governments. In some countries, we see the old central local government started reform at the same time. But then, of course, it's not that everything is supportive, because of course, if we see the research in public accounting, there are many research, many papers. They talk about the challenges. They talk about the consequences of reform. For instance, in one of the paper, Mark Christensen and his colleague, they argue that very often the benefits of acro accounting or benefit of accounting reforms are overstated. And if you go to practice, if you go to ground level, we won't see those kind of benefit. And some researchers also argue that the reforms we talk, like equal accounting, are technically complex for the government sector, because when we talk about government, we talk about bureaucracy, we talk about administrators, and they are technically well equipped in terms of accounting to handle those kind of advanced accounting reform. They lack reform. In some cases, they lack motivation. So it's technically very complex in terms of resources, in terms of expertise. And some researchers also argue that when we adapt equal accounting, this equal accounting has been been widely, it has been used by private sector entities, but the private sector entities, they have a clear goal, and the goal is to maximize their profit. But that is not the goal in public sector. So there's some researchers argue to what extent equal accounting will serve the public sector or public sector entities when they are being operated with different goals and different motives, objectives, etc. And in some contexts, we'll find the limited interest of user. For instance, we talk about UK, and UK has accrual accounting, both for accounting, both for accounting and budgeting. And they also prepare consolidated financial statement for the whole of government. And that statement is being prepared since 2011. But if you go and talk to the Treasury in the UK, very often the government officers complain that they develop very sophisticated, very advanced financial statement, but they don't find anyone using those statements because there's a lack of users. So then they were asking question, why do we need to spend so much resources and there's money or in terms of manpower to develop the report that no one is going to use? So that are also some of the claims. And we see that, like in some context of developing countries, we have experienced some adverse consequences to governance and accountability. Like in Africa or even in some countries, we see there's a professional rift, because when they start implementing reform, there was a conflict between government accountants and private sector accountants. And in some contexts, let's say there are papers in Africa, and they talk about, for instance, like Bakre, they talk about in the adoption of IPSAS in Nigeria, and they argue that the government in Nigeria has adapted accrual accounting, but when they have to value their asset, they're still using historical costs. So it depends there. So the governments are using not using accrual accounting in a way it should be implemented, and that created problem in governance and accountability. So there are, of course, a lot of decisions about accrual accounting as well. And more recently, some researchers like Stecolini, Grossi, Brassi, they argue that NPM has been very good for public sector accounting research, because in the last 2 decades, we have seen a lot of papers. We have seen the increasing use of theories in understanding public sector accounting. We see the use of mixed methodology. So there's a lot of development in public sector accounting research, but also at the same time, we see that because very often the public sector accounting research is connected to NPM, and they are not going beyond NPM, and that is a problem, because public sector accounting is not just to develop a report, financial statement, or develop budget, or that could improve efficiency and effectiveness, but we also need to go beyond. We need to understand how accounting can be used to address the problem created by these challenges like climate change, sustainability, digitalization. Those issues are becoming more important, and those issues are not being much covered by public sector accounting research. So these researchers argue that NPM has become a golden case, because many researchers, they're still confined with NPM, they're still confined with this institutional paper, because I also work as an associate editor for Journal of Public Budgeting, Accounting, Financial Management, and we receive a lot of paper from Indonesia and other countries as well, from Asia, and very often we see the researchers still, like even after 5, 6, 10 years, we see the same kind of institutional theory like coercive, mimetic, normative. That is the only theory they are using even after so many years. So I think you need to go, or not you, but we need to go beyond. We need to explore more. So that is the criticism some of the researchers have highlighted. So when you talk about public sector accounting and in like emerging economies, then it's very much disseminated by international organization and accounting profession that can be called epistemic communities. And these accounting reforms are propagated or disseminated to developing countries by referring to best accounting practices, because those accounting practices are adapted by Western countries, and they also argue those accounting reforms will help improve governance, accountability, and economy. And at the same, in some countries, we also see, because these reforms are directly connected to development, because they argue, okay, if it is very important for less developed countries to improve their governance, to achieve the goal of development and good governance. And the argument is to improve governance and to achieve the goal of development, it's very important also to improve accounting practices, budgeting practices, reporting practices. And those practices will help public finance more transparent. That will help public finance more accountable. And in that way, the goal of development can be achieved. So that is the whole idea being presented to emerging economies. But there are also, if you look at some paper, and those paper, we also find these paper are kind of criticizing the notion of development, because what is development then? They argue that it is a post-war invention. It represents both the social reality and actions taken in countries that have been referred to as underdeveloped. And development indicators were formalized based on industrial advancement and processes of industrialization emanating from US and the Europe, because they argue that the whole concept of development, what they think about development, may not be adequate or may not represent the context of development or these emerging markets. So these are some of the ideas being presented in this paper. And they argue that because this notion of development has been captured by international organizations like World Bank or International Monetary Fund, Asian Development Bank, and they try to impose that discourses in developing ways, connecting development with public sector accounting reform. And if you look at that, how there are like research like Hopper and Van Helden, and they talk about the interrelationship between public sector accounting or accounting and development. And they have identified 3 stages or 3 types of 3 discourses of international organization. Because in the 1960s or 70s, if you look at these eras, 1960s or 70s, and there were a concept that, okay, development can be achieved to the government, because the government can, for instance, so they try to promote this state-owned enterprises. They propagated state monopolies. They were claiming the importance of national planning. They say it's a traditional public administration. So the whole idea was that the government can be a key driver in achieving development. And they argue that to help government achieve the goal of development, they need to follow some kind of centralized cash or centralized budget accounting. That could contribute to national planning. So therefore the whole idea was these organizations were promoting cash-based accounting or program budgeting, like those kind of accounting techniques in developing countries. But if you see 1980, there is a change in the sense, because now the concept was, okay, development can be achieved not through the state, development can be achieved through market. So the most important thing was markets should be operated freely. Yeah, it's like this. These organizations were promoting like free trade. They were talking about competition and not the state monopolies, but they were talking about competition. They were talking about private capital. They were talking about new public management reform, equity accounting. So the idea was, if the government, if the country were, if the market, if to allow market to run freely, it's very important to adopt accounting technologies that support that discourse. No, so they were talking about it's very important for government to implement accrual accounting or performance auditing, expenditure tracking survey. It's very important for government to undertake PFA assessment. So all these techniques are very important, because that will support this kind of market to function freely, and that is how a country can be developed. So that was the idea during 1980s of this international organization. And if you see the more recently, of course, then we see there are two things now these organizations are talking. At the central level, they argue that this new public management or accrual accounting reforms are very important. But at the local level, they argue that it is very important to have some kind of, localized development, because they find that there's a loose connection between central and local level. And the argument was that accrual accounting or reporting or performance budgeting have been not adequate to integrate local level into this development process. So they talk about more like a localized led development. They say there should be a participatory budgeting. They argue that participatory at the local level, participatory budgeting is very important. It's very important to have the climate budget, gender budgeting, or it's very important to have climate codes. So those things have become very important. So what is the discourse now? The discourse is that, okay, when this organization talk about development, they talk about at the central level, there should be competition. The markets should drive the development process at the central level, and therefore the governments is very important for government or public sector entities to improve their accounting by adapting accrual accounting, reporting, performance based evaluation, auditing, etc. But at the local level, the countries or governments are also required to integrate development, or at least to make development more inclusive, and that required them to implement certain accounting technologies like participatory budgeting, gender budgeting, climate code, etc. So that is the notion they have been propagating in the last few years. And more recently, we did one literature review for Journal of Accounting in Journal of Accounting in Emerging Economy, and we found that although now there are two levels of development discourses, we still find NPM developing countries, NPM or this market-based concept is driving reform, and even in countries like China, because for instance, one of the Zhang argue that contrary to the claim that new liberal ideas of efficiency weaken state institutions, such rationalities have been deployed in China through accrual accounting to refine an understanding of a stronger stake. So the whole idea was, even like country like China, where they are against the ideas of against the idea of efficiency or neoliberal reform, they have been adapted those kind of reforms through accounting by adapting equal accounting. So you see this this market-led reforms are influencing public sector accounting changes. But at the same time, how is the views are divided about the extent to which accounting reform would improve governance and accountability, especially when they are introduced without taking into account the institutional and contextual element. So the whole idea, of course, the idea, there are some research that they argue that, let's say, accounting reforms in whatever form, they are not bad, because we can't blame or complain accounting reform. But the most important thing is those reforms should be implemented by taking into account the context, yeah? Because in some contexts, some reform may not be fitted. So it's very important to understand the institutional or contextual elements before implementing accounting reform. And then also there's a house that like I mentioned, now it's more and more research that they argue that now it's very important for developing country not just to think about this new public management or new public governance. We need to think about the wider implication of public sector accounting in society. So before implementing reform, what is important is to determine to what extent that reform will help improve the overall governance, or to what extent that reform will help improve the life and livelihood of people in developing countries. Any questions so far?
No? Still learning, sir?
No, okay. Then I'll continue, yeah?
Yep.
So I'm taking you about so I'm going through some of the literature now, because there are, of course, if you look at the literature on public sector accounting and in emerging economies, then we see the divided views. On the one hand, there are some papers that claim the benefits of accrual-based techniques or accrual accounting reform. For instance, a study by Tahawi, this study shows a positive relationship between IPSAS and corruption prevention, but they argue that it's very important for countries or government to adapt accrual accounting as intended. That means full accrual-based techniques are put in place, because the idea is in many cases we see governments, they are taking some elements of accrual accounting, but they are not adapting accrual accounting in a holistic way. For instance, like even Indonesia or even Thailand, because they are more focused on accrual reporting. But when it comes to budgeting, because there's still the cash-based budgeting is more dominant, because politicians or administrator, they are still more comfortable with cash-based budgeting than accrual-based budgeting. But in terms of reporting, there is accrual-based reporting. So we can see there's a mismatch, and those kind of mismatch will kind of prevent getting the benefits of accrual accounting. And in other study, because they also there's other research that they took sample of 54 developing countries, and they also show the adoption of ES is generally associated with or domestic payments unaffected. As a result, there is a benefit of increased debt financing having adapted to IPSA. So they argue that if when the government have to borrow money from international market, or when the governments have to take loans, and it's much easier for them if they are using international standards. So that is the finding of the study. And also the claim that the significance of public financial management reform in preventing corruption and improving transparency, governance, and accountability are abound in report. So means we find a similar kind of benefit, let's say the international accounting standard or accrual accounting or other public sector accountings are important for preventing reform. It's very important. These are important for improving transparency, governance, accountability. So those notions are abound in the reports and studies by international organization, standard setter, and the accounting profession. But if you look at the research, then you find a lot of different consequences. Yeah. For instance, there's a lot of papers on South Asia, even India, and they say like in the research argue that, for instance, in the case of Nepal, they started with accrual accounting reform, and in the process they found it's a very challenging, very resource consuming, and so they moved back to cash accounting, adapting the cash basis IPSAS. And you see the Sri Lanka, because they adopted cash basis IPSAS in 2007, and the idea was to make a transition to accrual accounting, but the whole process delayed because of this how the technical complexities or lack of resources. So those things are affecting the reform. And even in, like, for example, if you see the Bangladesh, you see this because when they started reforming public sector accounting, there was a conflict and distrust between the professional accountant and government accountant, because the idea was who is going to implement reform, and the professional accountants were claiming to implement reforms like accrual accounting is very important for government to include professional accountant, but the government accountants were not kind of ready to give their power to professional accountants. So we see a lot of conflict and distrust. And even in India, you see that there's a disparities between rationals and actual reasons. So, for instance, like and this paper argued that IPSAS adoption in India is likely to be delayed for 10 to 12 years due to the requirements of valuation of assets and liabilities when preparing the opening balance sheets. So in a big country like India, the problem is the valuation. So it's not easy to implement a reform, even the country or government wish to implement, because it requires valuation. There's a need to find depreciation. So there's a lot of technical issues involved, and it's not easy for many developing countries. Go to Latin America. In Latin America, you see the adoption of accrual accounting and IPSAS are kind of widespread. This accrual accounting IPSAS, and like Peru, Chile, Colombia, they have adopted accrual accounting and IPSAS, as well in many other countries. We see similar type of. But at the same time, the research by Busca et al., the research argued that although many Latin American countries have adopted accrual accounting and international standard, we see this the implementation is partial and ceremonial. Ceremonial means they adopted, but actual implementation is kind of weak. So there are some innovation, but some isomorphism rhetoric. So the whole idea is, because many countries, they are adapting reform by copying, by looking, let's say the other countries are reforming their public sector accounting. So that has inspired many countries in Latin America to implement reform. Actually, they are not analyzing what kind of reform they require. They're not making strategy how to implement reform, and they're not looking about the consequences. So the whole process seems to be a more rhetoric. That is the argument of some researcher. And also, like in more recent studies, you see this because some of the recent studies, they also, so there are some consequences of reform. For instance, there's a paper by Barros Alvarez, and they argue that like some big corporation in Latin America, they have adopted this public sector accounting reform, and one of the reason why they adopted reform was to improve efficiency and effectiveness. So in the process of delivering efficiency and effectiveness, they ignore or marginalize many other social and human related consequences. So it means the whole idea was maybe the accrual accounting is good in terms of maybe the accrual accounting has helped companies, big companies, state-owned enterprise to widespread their operation, but this has caused many human and social and environmental consequences. They argue those kind of things. So it's very important to see both the consequences of reform. And in Asia Pacific, of course, Pacific, we see there's a limit like in Indonesia, Thailand, many countries, they have adopted accrual accounting, but we still see a lot of paper talk about this limited capacity of processing accrual information. Basically, for instance, still the budget is kind of very much is cash, and the politicians and administrators, they are still using cash-based budget rather than going to the accounting statement. So the whole benefits or the intended benefit of accrual accounting haven't been engendered or obtained. And in Africa, we see there's of course the reforms have created some kind of even social problem, because let's say some of the papers, they argue that in countries like from Tanzania or even like Nigeria, they have adapted accrual accounting and international public sector accounting standards, but we see there's a lot of those reforms, instead of improving governance and accountability, in fact those reforms have created a space for corruption or political patronage to rise. Because, for instance, like in Tanzania, in local government, they said local governments are required to prepare financial statement following accrual principle, and when they develop this financial statement, auditors are just approving the report without monitoring, without checking. So we don't know whether they are really following accrual principle as intended, or they are just doing this for doing this as a ceremony. So there are a lot of so the whole reform, although these countries are developing their financial statement following accrual principle, the governance, accountability haven't been improved, and they haven't achieved any development as claimed by international organization. And there's a more so the idea is the international organizations and donors, they have failed to recognize the complex institutional and political context within Africa, and paid little attention to local embedded agency and resistance, while imposing Western-based accrual accounting and IFSAs on the continent. So the whole idea was, because the international organization or consultant, they are kind of ignoring the local context of Africa. They are ignoring the cultural factor, and they are saying, okay, this accrual accounting or one size fit approach will work in all contexts, disregarding local context, disregarding local culture, disregarding local resources, etc. And more recently, the paper by Posler, they argue that almost 70% of IFSA's reform in emerging and low-income countries have either failed to reach the confirmation stage, or the alleged confirmation has been manipulated. So very often we see the reforms have failed, and their success has been kind of manipulated. That is the finding of more recent study. So how about this localized led development then? Because I talk to you about at the local level now, the international organizations, they talk about, okay, it's very important to have more inclusive reform in the sense that will embed, how we say this, grassroots level people, and that will promote grassroots level development and governance. So if you see the data in the last few years, the World Bank has alone sanctioned around 85 billion for development assistance, focusing on public participation. Now, the key focus at the grassroots level is on promoting citizen or public participation. And at the local level, accounting technologies, for instance, have been presented as a tool. So they argue that accounting can be a tool for promoting inclusiveness, for promoting emancipation, for building trust, reinventing democracy. And they argue it's very important for it's very important, therefore, for governments to implement participatory budgeting, or gender budgeting, climate code framework. So that will help achieve this local inclusiveness, emancipation, and local level democracy. But even if you look at the papers, research paper, we see a mixed kind of, the results are kind of divided. Because, for instance, some paper argue, and of course, this participatory budgeting or like climate, gender budgeting are important. That may help promote engagement, that may help redistribute local resources, and that may even improve social justice and service quality. But at the same time, there are some papers, they argue that in the process of how is implementing those participatory budgeting or gender budgeting, we see it's not being worked as expected. In certain contexts, a certain group of people or elite people are capturing the whole process. In some cases, we see that there's a cultural factor, there's a political patronage, and that is kind of negating the effect of those mechanisms. And in some cases, we see more ceremonial, kind of a more ceremonial adoption of these practices. So the whole idea is localized led development, and accounting technology that are envisaged important to promote localized led development. That also have created some kind of divided view. So when they talk about, let's say, when we talk about participatory budgeting, there's a research that they argue that for participatory budgeting to be implemented successfully, there are certain criteria. For instance, there should be a willingness, or there should be an engaging civil society. There is a very strong support of political support is very important, like a mayoral support. Political environment is very important. A supportive political environment is required, so that the political capture, political attacks can be prevented. And at the same time, the availability of sufficient financial resources to fund the project. Like in some cases, local authorities or local governments were allowed to facilitate this participatory mechanism, but the budget allocated for those mechanisms is very little, and that had very little effect. So the whole idea is this: representation and inclusion in the participatory budgeting process have also remained key issues, especially in non-democratic and poor societies, given the existing power hierarchies in decision making. So the whole idea is, even we talk about participatory budgeting or gender budgeting, it is very important for us to consider about the local context, because if we don't consider local context, local culture, those measures, although they are very good, they may not work as intended. And when you talk about the local context, we did some research. Like in 2017, we studied about the public sector accounting reform in Nepal, and in that paper we used the strong structures and theory. And the key idea was the one thing is, when we talk about public sector accounting reform, there is an engagement of large number of stakeholders, because the government is engaged, there is auditors are engaged, there's the politicians are engaged, public administrators are engaged, international organizations are engaged, consultants are engaged, professional accountants. So means that you see engagement of a lot of different stakeholders, and we see the interaction between these stakeholders. But the one problem in many developing countries or emerging market is that when implementing public sector accounting reform, very often the government disregard the important role that can be played by government accountants, because all other stakeholders are very active, but in a way the government accountants are marginalized. Because when we talk about reform, when you talk about public sector accounting reform, that will come directly to government accountants. They are the one who should implement, who should adapt, who should implement reform, and very often those accountants or government accountants are kind of scared, because they need to provide training, they need to provide infrastructure, they need to provide assurance that the reforms are very important and they are capable of implementing reform, and they would be provided adequate resources and training. So those things are kind of not well addressed. So the whole problem was because the government accountants are not comfortable in implementing reform. So the whole process of reform didn't work as planned. And we went to Africa in 2021. We studied 9-10 countries about public sector accounting reform, and we found that okay, in this country, all these countries, there are some elements of good accounting practice, because they are developing consolidated financial statement. They are sending their consolidated financial statement for auditing on a timely basis. So there are like many good elements, but the whole idea was those local or those elements or local practices are ignored. So there is some kind of conception that they need to adopt the large scale government accounting reform like accounting or IPSAS are important, and those reforms were lead to improvement. So those kind of concepts are there at the local level, and that is the problem, because in doing so they are facing challenges to implementing those large-scale public sector account reform. But at the same time, the argument is that what is important is not to impose those large-scale public sector accounting reform, but what is important is to encourage those local practices to be developed. So the first stage is that it's very important to identify those good local accounting practices, and reforms should be built on following those local practices. So that is the problem we identify in Africa, because very often local practices are ignored, and this attempt to implement large-scale accounting reforms, and those reforms are not working. So the overall finding of prior work, so the overall one-size-fits-all application of accurate accounting and IPSAS have resulted in more unintended consequences rather than providing tangible benefits for governance, accountability. But the whole idea is we can't blame accounting system as say, because accounting system as such is not bad, but what is important is, but what is notable is the failure to understand the importance of context. For instance, it's very important to have education, it's very important to provide training, it's very important to get infrastructure, and it's very important to have commitment. So those things are missing, and that is and these factors are creating obstacle in implementing reform. So the idea is that careful analysis of socio-political feasibility, political interests, and other local societal effects should be undertaken prior to implementing large-scale reforms. So they're very important to consider those factors. And also there's a need to examine whether and to what extent local and beneficial accounting practices exist. So it's also very important is to identify whether any countries, any developing country, they already have some local practices, good practices, and whether reform can be built on those practices. It's also important to consider culture, it's important to consider infrastructure and resource availability. But of course, these are the finding of research. Yeah? So we see the really divided view. On the one hand, let's say we go to some research, we go to international organization, donors, and they provide a very good picture of accounting, public sector accounting reform. They argue that accurate accounting is very important, and even more important now because of financial crisis in the post-COVID era, because we need to know the sustainability of government. We need to know about the government, to what extent government is able to deliver public services. So in a sense, accurate accounting has become even more important. So that is argument. But if you come to the academic debate, and they argue that maybe accurate accounting is important, but it doesn't mean that countries would be able to implement accurate accounting without any preparation. So it's a long process. It's very important to identify the factors which could lead to the successful implementation of accurate accounting, and to restore those factors prior to implementing reform. And we also see this at the academic level. We see that this public sector accounting has become very important now. There's a lot of paper, rise in the number of papers, volume of research. We see more theoretically underpinned work. We see the work based on mixed method. And we see this now we have our own learned society. And also we see that increasing partnership between academic and practitioners, professionals with academics in the process of developing accounting standards. So we see the increasing acceptance and alternate. So we see there's an increasing collaboration between research and practice, and we see then how this context of increasing the acceptance of the importance of context. So these are some of the positive things happening. But how things are changing then? Let's say if we talk about post-COVID era, so what are the things being changed now? Because now we can see the debate has now moved. Because the last 20 years we talk about the importance of improving financial reporting of government, and we talk, okay, it's very important for government to implement accurate accounting and to improve the financial reporting. But if you look at the research, that is now changing. We see that the argument is that now the public sector accounting should be seen in the wider context of publicness. It means how public sector accounting contribute to society, and how public sector accounting will result in creating public value. So the idea is we should go beyond financial reporting, and it is very important for us to understand how public sector accounting can be better used to improve the life and livelihood of people. So the emerging attention to so there's emerging focus on a wider notion of publicness and public value. And so the whole idea is that because when we think about the wider role and consequences of public sector accounting, then it will then we should be able to create more fairer society. We should be provide better. We should be reflect more on sustainability, so etc. So it's very important for public sector accounting to have a wider view. And also they argue that accounting should be most grassroots oriented. It should promote emancipation, empowerment, and engagement, thereby emphasizing humanizing purpose. So the whole idea, because there's some research argue that it can, because we need to make public sector accounting more connected to these problems being faced by humans or individuals. And there's a strong engagement being sought with contemporary development. Also, they argue that public sector accounting has been this because when we talk about public sector, is a public sector accounting. There's a public administration. There's a public management. There's a public finance. There are many different how is a discipline. But when we talk about public sector accounting, we don't really try to get connected with public administration literature. We are not connecting with this how is a public policy debate. We are not connecting with social issues. So that is the problem, because we just talk about more about efficiency and effectiveness, but in the process we kind of marginalize many of the important issues. So some researchers argue that we need to be public sector accounting or public sector accounting researcher need to be more engaged with public administration issues of wider social relevance. So it means how public sector accounting can, but of course the argument that public sector accounting should create public value. But the question is how public sector can be developed so that it will help create public value. It will help address wicked problems. It will facilitate co-production. It will help build government financial resilience, and it will help tackle climate change and achieve sustainable development goals. So the most important thing is we talk about the important role of public sector accounting to achieve these wider objectives. But at the same time, we need to work on and we need to understand how public sector accounting can actually be implemented, or what kind of reforms or what kind of development we need so that public sector accounting can address those kind of wider issues. And they also argue that the notion of development and its connection and these countries need to be developed, but now we don't need to be development is not based on certain context. It should be an issue of how I say this content. And let's say when we talk about development, we should be talking about climate change. When you talk about development, we should be talking about digitalization. When you talk about development, we should be talking about sustainability. So and that those issues imply equally well to all contexts. So it's not that when you talk about development, we talk about emerging countries or poor countries, and then to improve the economy of these countries by facilitating public sector accounting reform. So the argument is that this development is also a wider notion.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, so now so what is the way forward then? Escaping, so the most important thing for us is go beyond the discussion of new public management and development, and then we need to think about how public sector accounting can be better developed, so that in a strong dialogue and collaboration across different disciplines within accounting profession, practitioners, and standard setters. Because that is one problem in public sector accounting. We see we need to forge collaboration, we need to start dialogue, we need to have a good partnership with the accounting profession, practitioners, standard setters, so we can develop a public sector in a more widely. I also say personalization, because it's still if we look at the curricula in the universities or even school, there's a lot of course students are there very few courses on public sector accounting. When they go to higher level, there's a very few universities that offer courses on public sector accounting and public sector professionalization, etc. Because we need to improve courses of education in public sector accounting because in any country, if you look at any country, almost 40% of GDP is covered by public sector. There's a public procurement, there's a lot of expenses by government. So almost 40, so we are kind of neglecting almost 40% of GDP that is covered by public sector. And because so the public sector accounting is very important in that sense also, because it covers huge area of GDP. So my conclusion is that we need to rethink of public sector accounting. It's not only a technical thing, but it is because we need to develop public sector accounting in a way so as to address issue of social significance. Public sector accounting should be able to generate public value. It should be able to emancipate communities, and it should promote a fair post-COVID society. A different perspective to explore. So we also need to explore new perspective and development. So it should not be based on geography, but it should embed contemporary issues affecting the lives and livelihood of people, such as climate change and other wicked problem. And therefore, future research should incorporate the wider approaches to development and explore what role public sector accounting can play in attaining these development issues, going beyond the contextual boundaries. So of course then what we are trying then, because we try to develop more understanding of public sector accounting in different ways. And for instance, I'm involved in these two special issues, one in finance accounting and management, where we try to study beyond new management accounting research, so publicness and localized led development can be embedded. So we have this special issue, and that will be available next 25 February. And there's one public sector, one special issue on public journal of public budgeting, accounting, and financial management. And this is related to climate change, accounting, reporting, and accountability. So if any of you would like to submit a paper, you are welcome. You can talk to me, and we'll find ways to help you. So please contact me if you like to submit a paper for this special issue. And in the past, if you look at the issue of Journal of Public Budgeting, Accounting, and Financial Management, it's a volume 23, volume 35, issue 3. There is a special issue on public sector. It is called Publicness, Accounting, and Budgeting in Emerging Economy. So you can take a look at this volume. And there is also a special issue on public sector accounting in the Journal of Accounting in Emerging Economics. It's a volume 11, 2021, issue 5. And this issue is about changing trends of public sector accounting in emerging economy. So you can get some more debate about public sector accounting going through this special issue. Yeah, and that's all from me.
Okay.
Any questions? I'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, that is a lot of knowledge. Yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of
from the open. So exciting to hear it. And then thank you, Professor Pawan. We get the brand new inspiring knowledge. It's time for Q&A section. Write your question in the chat box or raise your hand to ask your question directly to Professor Pawan. In this chat, this is we have one question.
So yeah, in mandatory
Professor from Nigeria.
Yeah, like in the UK, yeah, I think I know UK has adapted this IFRS both for public sector and private sector. So they follow IFRS, but at the same time, when it comes to public sector, certain elements of IFRS have been revised. So basically, if the UK follows all the requirements, let's say for VAT, IFRS, accrual accounting, and they prepare, because if you look at the consolidated financial statement of the UK government, and that is a publicly available document. You need to go to the HM Treasury website, and you see there's a consolidated financial statement for the UK government from 2011 onward, and you'll find there's a lot of social issues linked to social reporting and how the public sector has contributed to society or ESG. So those things are mandatory for UK. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Anything else, Mr. Nadira? Or do you want to directly make conversation with Professor? Okay, thank you, Prof. Anything else? Somebody else, please. Give an question. Okay, there is Mr. Antares Firman. Please. Yours. Please active your mic, Mr. Antares.
Professor.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Hello. Good to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the insights. I'm also a lecturer at the University, and it's very. I just currently become a student as well. I'm doing my PhD right now.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah. My research interest is in the intersections of conventional accounting and also the information system. So, Universitas Terbuka, we are public sector entities, and we have started recently a digital transformation initiative.
Oh yeah.
And actually, I think what you have explained have given me like a lot of insights, and you did mention about the political issues also influence, the public sector accounting policy in a way. And recently I've read like a lot of papers, and one of the issue also in the public sector accounting innovation is the organizational readiness, Professor. The organizational in Indonesia, we have that issue, and right now I'm going to do the research about the organizational readiness relation to your explanations earlier.
Yeah.
And probably you can advise me like what are the recent gaps that still we need to work on.
Yeah, that's
Thank
very
you very much, Professor.
Yeah, that's I think that's very interesting because of course I think it is a kind of right time to do the research on public value. Let's say we talk about public value, and then there's also debate what is meant by public value and how to create that, or how the accounting is public sector accounting is really implicated in the process of creating public value. So there are a few questions, and then you talk about organizational readiness. To what extent that will lead to the result in public value? So there's a lot of I think very interesting issues now. So I think one thing is of course because when you talk about public value, and then if you look at let's say Giuseppe or Steccaloni, and the argument is that because public value is because we need to go to create public value, we need to go beyond this kind of how's the narrow thinking of public sector accounting and see how public sector accounting can contribute to policy making, or how it is connected to public administration, public finance, and public policy. So there are more interdisciplinary pluralism. I think there's one called pluralism. So to what extent the pluralism has been captured by public sector accounting, and that is probably they try to connect that pluralism with public value. So my suggestion to you to go and read some of the paper and talk and see how they try to describe this pluralism, and then how they try to connect that with public value and how accounting is implicated in the process.
Okay, I will do, Professor. Thank you very much. I hope you mind to share your presentations.
No, of course, I'll send you that now, and then of course,
I'll go do some research on your papers as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I think there's many papers, like I think especially by Jana Steckler, see the editor of Finance and Accountability Management, and she does a lot of paper on work on publicness, and that is linked to public value. So and they argue how one element you mentioned is organized, embedded or readiness. So you can bring that, how that will result, or how that is important in the process of creating public values. So that will be very interesting.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. Antares. There is other participant want to ask something or discussion with Professor? Please raise hand or active the microphone. Anything else? Or you can get the question from the column chat. Nothing? It's enough? Okay, thank you, Professor Pawan, for the discussion. It's an honor to have you as our speaker today. We also like to say thank you for our participant who learning and discussion with us in the international ELecturing today. Before we, maybe it's enough time for sharing ELecturing today. Before we end the session today, I think I need the participant are expected to active the camera for photo session. Please active the camera. Okay, we will counting for the photo session. Please, the participant active the camera. Okay. Thank you. I will counting 1, 2, 3. Smile. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We hope we can see tomorrow. We will invite you to join our next section that it will be held tomorrow with the topic public sector accountability for climate change and circular economy. And then thank you very much, Professor Pawan. We see you tomorrow. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, participant. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bye.